Comics Podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
Because they have a home.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the podcast We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones. I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White. This is a clean comic book podcast where we discuss and review comics by DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, IDW, and more. You can find us on social media at Boneless Comics 1, on Twitter, and at Boneless Comics Podcast, pretty much everywhere else.
And don't forget to check out our website at bonelesscomicspodcast.com with more info about the podcast, links to places to listen to previous episodes, an Amazon store where you can buy your own copy of the comics we've reviewed, and it has a link to our YouTube channel where you can watch video episodes and find additional goodies.
And speaking of goodies, today we'll be discussing Avengers Annual Number 10, published in 1981 with pencils by Michael Golden, and the Cry Vengeance story from Marvel Superheroes Number 11, published in 1992 with pencils by Mike Fosberg, which were both written by Chris Claremont.
And there's a lot of other issues that go along with this, and I think we're going to mention a few through the discussion, but really the bulk of what we're talking about is really covered in these two publications. But if you want some bonus reading, there is a whole collection called Captain Marvel versus Rogue that has all of the comics that are related to that in one handy collection.
Wow.
Yeah. So let's talk about Chris Claremont. He was born in England, and his family moved to New York in the United States when he was 3 years old. He grew up reading British comic books like Dan Dare, Sky Pilot of the Spaceways, and didn't really get hooked on American comics until he was a senior in high school, where he started with The Fantastic Four by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby.
Good place to start.
Exactly. He graduated college with a degree in acting, and while he was trying to get into the acting profession, he got a part-time job at Marvel with the intention to stay like maybe 6 months to earn enough money to pay his rent. Meanwhile, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had found some, success with the Fantastic Four and Thor as well, and they were having some difficulty finding an audience for the X-Men. So in an effort to revitalize that series, they introduced the all-new X-Men with Giant Size X-Men number 1 in the first half of 1975, with an international group of heroes featuring the German Kurt Wagner, the Russian Pyotr Rasputin, the African-American Aurora Monroe, the Canadian named Logan, better known as Wolverine, and the Native American John Proudstar. So eventually part-time for Chris Claremont became full-time, and he was writing more frequently until he was given the chance to take over on the Uncanny X-Men, which he wrote for 17 years, from the 70s through the 90s, which is, as far as I know, the longest run on superhero comics by the same writer, like ever.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Yeah, he was there for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote things like the Dark Phoenix Saga, which ranks as like one of the great comic stories, or greatest, I should say, and was one of the main inspirations for the third X-Men film, and then followed closely by Days of Future Past, which also provided the story for the film of the same name. He created many of the iconic characters such as Kitty Pryde, Jubilee, Psylocke, and Emma Frost, and others, and co-created many, many others. He's known for his strong character writing and development with deep emotion, but he was also writing at a time where they were trying to get away from what one artist actually described as the housewife heroes. So Claremont says he asked himself, why am I disfranchising half the audience and half the population? My feeling was, if you're going to put these characters, these X-Men, in harm's way, why is it any different for them just because they're of gender? Any more than Kurt or Colossus would be different from Cyclops and how they approach the overall circumstance. So we started getting into characters are different because they're different characters, not because they are of a different race, ethnicity, gender, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
There was some criticism for his work is that they call like writer's exposition or purple prose, which is a tendency to introduce each and every character in each and every issue in a way that occasionally feels disjointed in the era of the trade paperback, because you have everything all together here. So when I'm towards the end here, I don't need to be reintroduced to a character that I knew at the beginning of the trade paperback. But the idea back then, when these issues were coming out, is that they were trying to grow their reader base for new fans jumping on. And with so many new characters in the X-Men universe, that's a lot to keep up with. So I think that was one of the things that really contributed to his success, and something that, I would look forward to in going back and reading those comics, because I don't know who half the X-Men are. So it was interesting.
Yeah, that actually makes me want to dive into X-Men comics specifically by him, because
Hmm.
I know that he and one of my favorite Fantastic Four writers, John Byrne, uh, were kind of on the book at the same time. I think Byrne was doing pencils, not writing. But the fact that he introduces everybody is like, oh, cool, because that's always the barrier to me with X-Men is like there's so many characters and I
Yeah.
haven't been following them for like 30 years. So like, where do I jump on? Um, I did want to briefly mention that I did meet Chris Claremont at a con.
Oh,
I
nice.
don't know, like a year or two before the pandemic started. So I mean, we haven't
Mhm.
been doing cons for a while until I'm gonna go back to my first one I've been to since like 2019 here in a couple weeks. So I'm excited about that. And Claremont's gonna be there again. But he created the character of Valeria Richards, who is
Mm.
the Fantastic Four's daughter, but he created her as a future teenage variant that we thought her father might be Doctor Doom. And that was like this weird, like alternate future that might come true, but we don't know if it's going to. But anyway, her first appearance is in the FF, and I had him sign that. So, uh,
Nice.
from meeting him, I have to say that, and this is definitely something that's going to come up as we get into story analysis. But I was like, hey, I really loved your Fantastic Four. That's what got me into the characters. And he's like, oh, cool. Let me flip through this issue. And he looked through it and he like found stuff that was cool. And then he started talking about X-Men for like 20 minutes. And so yeah, that's something that will be relevant as we get into the story analysis. But I wanted to
That's
mention
funny.
that because it was very apparent that those are the characters that he has, the
Yeah.
greater affinity for. So,
So a follow-up question on that, and we asked this question, I think the last couple episodes we've been asking this for
mhm.
people who are born in, like, say, England, and then they move to the US at a young age. What kind of accent did Chris Claremont have? Was it like American or British?
It was American. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, I know what you're doing. Here's some mud in your eye about Don Granger. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah, he definitely sounds like an American.
Well, but we've
He
brought that up a couple different times though. It's like,
right.
well, what accent would they have? And we kind of speculate, but this is like somebody who actually lived that origin story.
It's true.
So I was just curious.
He also told a quick story about Stan Lee because this was the year that he passed.
Uh,
And he said that basically there was like a want ad in the newspaper or something like that. And he called Marvel, again, trying to get that 6-month gig. And he was like,
mhm.
Stan Lee actually answered the phone because they had like 4 employees at the
Oh,
time
wow.
or something like that. So he's like, hello there, true believer. Who is this? And, he's just like, hi, I'm Chris. I'm here for the internship or whatever. And so like, that was the era where you could just get him on the phone like he wasn't a massive
Wow.
celebrity yet. And so yeah, it's really crazy that he started during that period. He's kind of like right after Lee as far as his comics legacy, but knew him very well apparently. So yeah.
Hmm.
Anyway, moving on to the pencilers, Michael Golden, who did Avengers Annual Number 10, is best known for his late 70s and early 80s work at Marvel Comics, where he co created Rogue with Chris Claremont. He's also responsible for co creating the character of Bucky O'Hare, which eventually spawned an animated series and 2 video games by famed developer Konami in 1992. I watched a little bit of footage of somebody playing one of those games on the NES, and it has like a death laser section like Mega Man 2 in it.
Hmm.
So it looks incredibly hard, but that's just kind of
Wow.
the NES. So there you go.
Yeah.
Anyway, while Golden served as senior art director for Marvel Comics and a story editor for DC, he actually prefers commercial work and advertising and says that there it's something different every time. So I guess he gets
Hmm.
tired of doing like the sequential art.
Yeah.
He's also notoriously uncomfortable with the convention circuit and didn't make any appearances between 1979 and the early 2000s. So good luck
Wow.
getting a Michael Golden penciled issue signed.
Hmm.
Art Adams is the contemporary comic book artist who claims to be the most influenced by Golden's work. So, and you can see him all over Marvel titles doing
Hmm.
cover work and all kinds of things these days. So that's who did the Avengers issue that we're covering, and then the Marvel superheroes issue, which I believe that was kind of an anthology book where it had like multiple stories per issue. Mike Vosberg was the penciler for that. And he started doing professional work at the age of 15 when he started Masquerader, which was one of the first comic book fanzines in 1962.
Wow.
So shortly after that, he began a career in underground comics that existed without the Comics Code Authority. So,
Mm,
kind of doing stuff that would be censored if they had that label on the cover, but just self-publishing it, anyway. But
yeah.
eventually that got him popular enough that he landed work on horror titles at Western Publishing and Charlton Comics, which Charlton, their superheroes were like the Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, The Question, and Peacemaker, actually. And then they were
Hmm.
bought by DC eventually. So Charlton was sort of like an earlier comic company that got into trouble, and then DC bought them, and now they own those characters. During the late 70s and early 80s, he finally began his work for the Big Two, where Vosberg is most known for Savage She-Hulk and G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero. His largest claim to fame, however, yeah, go Joe.
G.I. Joe.
His largest claim to fame, however, is as the title sequence storyboard artist and title card designer for Tales of the Crypt, which aired from 1989
Really?
to 1996.
That's
Yeah, so
funny.
apparently they did these title cards for every episode of that show that were styled after like 1950s horror comic book covers, and
Huh.
Vosberg drew like all of those except one, it looks like.
Wow.
So, yeah. And so while he occasionally comes back to comics, he mostly works in film and television now, where he's done storyboards for big directors like Robert Zemeckis. So
Hmm.
there you
Nice.
go.
All right, well, let us dive into our characters. So first up, we have Carol Danvers, aka Ms. Marvel. She was introduced in 1968 in Marvel Superheroes number 13 as a supporting character, an officer in the U.S. Air Force and security chief of a restricted military base, where she met the alien hero Mar-Vell, aka Captain Marvel, in his human disguise of Dr. Walter Lawson. So if you have seen the movie Captain Marvel, that they changed a little bit, as they do often in movies from comics. So in the original origin in the comics, Mar-Vell is a he who is Dr. Walter Lawson. So a year later in Captain Marvel number 18, now Captain Marvel being Mar-Vell, not Carol Danvers, during a battle between the alien Kree villain Yon-Rogg and Mar-Vell, a Kree device called the Psyche Magnetron explodes, with Carol caught in the blast. So then fast forward nearly 7 years later in Ms. Marvel number 1, where she gets her own title, we find out that her DNA and that of the alien Mar-Vell's had fused during this incident, turning her into female spin-off of a well-known male hero. But just like Supergirl and Batgirl were originally spin-offs that came into their own, Carol grew in popularity and eventually became one of the primary members of the Avengers. I think at one point she was supposed to be like a love interest for Mar-Vell as well. And so it was one of those where we started a character, in some kind of way. They ended up being way more popular, I think, than they originally intended. And then, became their own character. So when you think of Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers, Ms. Marvel, you don't really think about, in 2023, her being an offshoot from Mar-Vell, Captain Marvel, because his book ended, and we'll talk more about that later. But it wasn't until like about 30 years later in 2012 when writer Kelly Sue DeConnick launched a new series with Carol in the lead as Captain Marvel. So for more details on and discussion on what happened during those 30 years, tune into our YouTube channel for our after show. And then for more details and discussion on the characters who have been known through the years as Ms. Marvel, go back and listen to our after show from the episode Ms. Marvel Civil War II, also on YouTube, where we go through all of that. So our other main character we want to talk about is Rogue, or Anna Marie. So Rogue, on the other hand, than Carol, she was first slated to appear in Ms. Marvel number 25 in 1979, and they supposedly actually even completed artwork for the first half of the story, but the book ended. Ms. Marvel's title got canceled, and this original intro for Rogue did not go published in 1979. And it wasn't until it was printed in Marvel Superheroes number 11 in 1992 that we got the story that was originally supposed to be there. So
Okay.
in
Well, that answered the
publication,
question that I had. Yeah.
yeah, In publication history, her first appearance was technically in Avengers Annual number 10, published in 1981, but it was supposed to have been, 2 years sooner in Ms. Marvel number 25, but it never came to be. So they sort of wanted to tie up a few loose ends and publish the story that they never finished and add some more to Avengers Annual number 10. So that's why we got the Marvel Superheroes number 11 in 92, but more on that later.
Okay.
So Rogue's real name and her early history were not really revealed until about 20 years after her introduction. Basically, at some point, and I think this is kind of similar to the X-Men movie as well, a young girl named Anna Marie grows close to a boy named Cody Robbins, gets kissed, but her latent mutant power emerges, which is to absorb the life energy and psyche of others with skin-to-skin contact. So naturally, that didn't end well for either of them. Not long after, she's approached by Mystique, who is also known as Raven Darkholm, who is a shapeshifter. Mystique seeks out Rogue on the advice of Irene Adler, who is also known as Destiny. She is a blind mutant precognitive who is able to accurately predict future events. This is a common theme with Chris Claremont, but more on that later.
Yeah.
So Mystique takes Rogue in as like an adoptive daughter, but in time she turns Rogue's loneliness, envy, bitterness, and despair into anger and recruits her into the Brotherhood of Mutants, which are an evil X-Men group. But even though Rogue first appears as a villain, after the events in our story, she later gets help from Charles Xavier, who welcomes her into the School of Gifted Youngsters and eventually becomes a member of the X-Men. But we'll get to that later after we talk about the fighting.
Yeah. There's not going to be much of that in this. So
No.
the thing that stuck out to me as most interesting is, if I'm to understand you correctly, were the pencils also completed for that original first appearance of Rogue, or
Like
was that, or were the finishes done
so?
later? Because when I read it, it doesn't look like a '90s book. It looks like something that was very much done a decade or so earlier, and what sucks about that is Mike Vosberg would have been the one getting those fat royalty checks for every time Rogue shows up in comics. But because that book got canceled, it looks like Michael Golden is the one that gets to cash those checks whenever she shows up again. So,
Yikes.
so
I don't know.
that kind of sucks. But I'm pretty sure that's the way royalties work, because that wasn't published. I don't think he would get the co-creator credit, even though maybe he did that first. So
interesting. Well, hopefully they reach some kind of agreement, but as we have, I think, talked about before, there's a lot of various lawsuits that go on between these artists, writers, and large companies, because at what point do you say the character belongs to the writer or the artist who invented them versus the publication company? So that's a whole nother, maybe we'll discuss that on a lawyery episode like Daredevil or She-Hulk or something. Got to throw that lawyer in there so we all know it's lawyer.
That's right. They are lawyers. You're correct.
They are lawyers. You are right. Yes, I agree.
So our story today is really sort of just a collection of 2 issues. So we don't have like an overall name for the story, but it's essentially the story of how Captain Marvel fought Rogue or Miss Marvel fought Rogue, and sort of how Rogue got her superhuman abilities besides the ability to just touch people and absorb their strength. So Carol Danvers, who was Miss Marvel at the time, was building a new life for herself in San Francisco when the mutant Rogue ambushed Carol to absorb her powers to be later used in a planned attempt to free captured members of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. But something went wrong. Carol fought too long, too fiercely, and instead of temporarily stealing Carol's abilities and memories, Rogue's transfer became permanent. So the important thing to note here is, if you only know Rogue from the movies, Rogue can fly and has super strength and superhuman durability in the comics. And the reason for that is because of this prolonged contact with Miss Marvel when they were having a fight. So that already is like a big difference between her and the live action adaptations that we've seen. But the bulk of it that we're covering today is actually in Avengers Annual number 10, where Carol Danvers is saved from a fatal fall into the San Francisco Bay by Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman. Unable to lift her from her coma, however, she enlists the help of Professor X, who reveals that Carol's mind has been completely wiped, and the party responsible is Rogue of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Yeah, this is still when they were calling themselves the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. So
Mhm.
little bit obvious there, but whatever. Meanwhile, Rogue wages war on the Avengers, absorbing power after power, and finally freeing the other members of the Brotherhood. Salvation comes as Spider-Woman is able to free Iron Man from captivity and turn the tide of battle against Mystique, Rogue, and the other evil mutants. But as the Avengers celebrate their victory, Carol Danvers reveals that while they may have won the battle, they failed her, and she will be recovering from their apathy for some time. And that's pretty much in a nutshell what goes on in this story. So stick with us, everybody, and we'll do the discussion after the break.
Grab her, Rogue! What are you doing? Something's happening, Mama! I'm scared! You knew what would happen next. I had Ms. Marvel's super strength and her ability to fly permanently, but that wasn't all. I also had her mind trapped inside me. That's when the spells started.
You stole my powers. You stole my life.
The second time I had to leave the place I called home. What's gonna happen to Ms. Marvel?
I'm sorry, Rogue, but I cannot return her to her real body. For now, I can only quiet her, for both your sakes.
Welcome back, everybody. So we are here to discuss Captain Marvel versus Rogue, and I think one thing that sets this apart from previous reviews is that this is the first time that we've really reviewed what is essentially a major character's first appearance in comics. So I didn't know this coming in, that Rogue began her comics history as a supervillain. I thought maybe she and Carol had some kind of beef and it was like, or a Civil War situation where they had like an ideological difference, but I did not know that coming into this story. Did you already kind of have an inkling of that because of your history with Captain Marvel, or?
Yeah, and knowing that like Mystique had adopted Rogue, I knew that she was, part of that evil band of evil mutants. But it's really cool because both Rogue and Ms. Marvel, Carol, with so many, everybody has so many different names.
I know.
But those two characters, like, every superhero has been full of retcons and where they change their powers or they change things about their character or, things like that. And, these characters definitely have that, but I feel like they have more journeys where they start off being introduced a certain way. And then, now where we are in the 2020s, they've come a long way from where they were originally introduced. And, Rogue first being a villain, and then what she goes through, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the story, but like, this is a traumatic event, obviously, for Carol, but it's also traumatic for Rogue in various different ways. And there's some like aftermath that happens with her. And then eventually, she gets redeemed and joins the X-Men as a hero character. So I think it's really cool because if you just focus on the more recent comics, you're going to miss a lot of that, very rich backstory.
Yeah, it is interesting to me because I didn't realize she was going to be so like arch villain in this. I mean, she's the action scenes and stuff. She's basically just like, I'm evil. I'm doing what I can because Mystique told me to, and I'm totally on these guys' side. And I really wasn't expecting that. I thought it was going to be more where it seemed like she was being coerced or, something like that. And, but I think the angle that Claremont is taking on it really is just that she was vulnerable and alone. And Mystique is somebody that's like her because she's a mutant. And Mystique just kind of used her naivete and, her need to like find a group to belong to be like, well, hey, we have this brotherhood here of mutants, they're evil
mutants,
and you might want to join up with that. So, I think she feels like, and there's not a lot in the story to justify this, but you can kind of read into it. I think she feels like I'm doing what I can to protect like the only family that I have, which is these mutants here, like Pyro, Avalanche, Mystique, and the Blob,
Destiny.
I guess is the other one. Oh yeah, and Destiny. Destiny is important because she's a very Chris Claremont character. Yeah, so it was very surprising to me. I wasn't expecting her to be as violent as she was and as committed to the bad guys, because again, that's all I know is like hero Rogue. So,
Mhm.
and certainly in the X-Men movies, which I'm going to have to admit have really affected my perception of the character, we skipped that whole villain phase entirely, because
Yeah.
she, like in the movies, she's cold and alone, and Logan finds her, and then he brings her to Professor Xavier, and then they're both kind of like, this guy's kind of a nerd. Like, I don't know about him. Like, and they kind of bond, and that kind of is enough to keep her on the side of the Angels. So
Yeah.
it's definitely different to see her like full supervillain, and then, needing to make that transition. And honestly, that aspect of it made me want to keep reading more than the stuff with Miss Marvel, because I feel like Miss Marvel's story is mostly wrapped up here as far as the story that we're telling in this issue. But for Rogue, I know that she's got like a long journey ahead of her. So, yeah.
Well, Carol does too, but a lot of it is rather like, I think Rogue's battle is more mental, whereas Carol's, I mean, it's mental, but it's like getting back out there. Like Carol's trying to get it back out there and figure out what her powers are, and she goes through
Right.
different iterations, which we'll talk about in the after show. But I think this is equally as important for Carol, because this is a, character defining moment where,
Sure.
she has to rediscover herself because it all gets stolen from her. So who is she
Right.
without this? And that's the one thing that the Captain Marvel movie doesn't, obviously doesn't go into. And it sort of takes a little bit from the character, because she has to figure out, who she is and what she has to contribute, and sort of regain this. And she goes through these different phases. And in the movie, it's basically like they did a really good job of kind of getting her like pinned down to where she was being subverted, and then she had to break free of that. So I like that they used like a kind of a similar like motivation. But this is just such a big event that, it's hard to really skip it for either character. And obviously both movies they did, but maybe we'll see more in the future.
And again, going back to the first X-Men movie, superhero movies were very much self-contained at that time. So you're not going to reference a non-mutant character. And then when we got to the Captain Marvel movie, Disney had not repurchased Fox yet. So, they weren't able to use the mutant characters. So it had to be separate. They had to come up with something else because of rights issues. But yeah, this just feels, definitely for Miss Marvel. I'm going to call her Miss Marvel because that's who she is in this story. Definitely for Miss Marvel, this feels so much more connected to the Marvel universe at large than like the impression I got from her movie, where it was kind of like Nick Fury is there, but she's kind of just on her own, doing her own thing. And this very much feels like this is taking place in the larger world of Marvel. So yeah,
it seems like X-Men, a lot of their stories end up being very convoluted. And I know this happens all the time in comics, but maybe it's Chris Claremont's doing, I don't know, but it's like, the son of somebody's future possible, alternate reality maybe comes back into the present and does this stuff, who sends this person into the past, and then this person marries that person, and then they had a child who got sent to the past who's actually from the future and this dimension and over here. And you're just like, okay, wait, what? If you don't keep up with what's going in continuity, it's easy to be very confused.
Yes. The future is only the present that has yet to come.
Until it's in the past.
Exactly. So yeah, I really do think that that's a Chris Claremont thing. Like I mentioned earlier, the Fantastic Four storyline that he did involved a future daughter of theirs that came back in time and was trying to protect the family. And so, I think that that's definitely a theme that he deals with. You mentioned Days of Future Past. That's, that's something that Chris Claremont wrote. He's very interested in this concept of like, not just like precognition, but destiny. That seems to be, and of course there's a character named Destiny in this, but that seems to be a theme that he returns to a lot, and this story is no exception. So,
well, maybe it was the family of Claremonts that invented the word clairvoyant.
You should probably
not,
fact check that, but yeah, I don't know.
Starts with the same sound, so it works in my book.
It's not exactly clear to me. So another character that shows up in this quite a bit actually, and is very primary, was Jessica Drew. And so we were not real happy with her miniseries that we read a couple years ago. How did you feel about her here in this story versus, how she was portrayed there?
I don't know. I mean, she was more of a supporting character, and
Mhm.
I mean, she's the one who rescues Carol when she's thrown off the bridge and takes her to the hospital and helps ID her. I kind of feel like it was, Chris Claremont wanting to have like a strong female character sort of involved with the story. So maybe that's why we got her, because it's not that her powers were necessarily
Well, I mean, she
needed.
saved Iron Man too at the end. Like, he
But
wouldn't have been
yeah,
able to come back without her charging him up.
true. And
So,
she's wearing an outfit that, Rogue's not able to get a hold of her powers. So
mhm.
she does have some things that are specific to her. So I mean, it's always cool to see Spider-Woman actually being like utilized in a good way, and
Mhm.
not, either pheromones or skin tight outfits with Hydra agents making comments. But yeah.
Yeah, I actually really liked her in this story. I thought that she was well implemented, mainly for what you said before. The fact that she has a costume that covers her entire body meant that Rogue couldn't affect her because she couldn't make skin to skin contact.
Hmm.
And that was a big deal. So it felt to me like she was very intentionally chosen to be one of the Avengers that was used for this story. So I really liked seeing her. And I also just really liked that she felt involved in the action and stuff, and she was a secondary player, but I would almost put her out as like maybe like the third lead under Rogue and Captain Marvel in this,
Hmm.
because she drives the story forward whenever Carol is unconscious, for most of it,
Yeah,
and things like
true.
that, because she's the one investigating. She's the one coming to the Avengers and letting them know, like, hey, this happened. What's your deal? Tell me her backstory, all of that. So in a lot of ways, I felt like she was moving the story forward more than Miss Marvel, because Miss Marvel's really in a coma for almost this entire story. So,
Yeah,
which,
she can't do much to move it forward when in that
yeah,
state, right?
yeah,
Well, and it's funny too, because, Spider-Woman, who wears a very skin tight outfit, is the one saving all of these really beefy dudes who are showing skin. And
yeah,
that's the reason that she's able to say, well, not the only reason, but it's just it's kind of a funny, like, because of the skin on skin contact thing. But that's really interesting too, how Rogue basically takes down the Avengers by, you know, absorbing their power. And also she gets like, I think like recent memories or part of their psyche, or there's
hmm
something along with that,
yeah.
along with the
That
powers.
surprised me.
So then not only does she get this like superhuman ability that she didn't have before, but now she knows secrets that the Avengers have. And the more Avengers that she gets, the more secrets that she has, and she knows how to fight them and, take them down and that sort of thing. So
hmm
she becomes a very big threat very quickly. And it's, yeah, really awesome to see, Spider-Woman be able to thwart that, not just in, not being able to have that skin to skin contact, but by being a competent fighter, and by, saving
Right.
Iron Man, because apparently all you have to do is put some kind of weird restraining bolt on the back of his iron looking suit, and now he can't do anything. Oh no, danger, danger.
Yeah, I wasn't a fan of that sequence, but
That seemed like a plot
I
device.
it was very much like you could see the hand of the writer going, "This needs to happen now
Hmm.
because Iron Man is too much of a problem." So, like,
Yeah.
okay,
Well,
I
because
get
you're
it,
not going to
but
get skin contact with him. So how else do you take him
right.
down? Some, unknown device is able to, seize up his armor, and he's
That
out of
that
commission.
Mystique conveniently happens to just have. I
Hmm.
mean, they do reveal in the superheroes issue later that Mystique was doing some kind of arms deal with somebody, so maybe she's pulling in like
Yeah.
illegal technology and stuff. Maybe that justifies it more, but that was not published when this issue came out.
Yeah.
So,
I think they just left it up to being the mystique of her character.
mhm. Yeah. So, speaking of the X-Men, and this is not a deep discussion at all, but it was just something I noticed when they were showing the X-Men in the Danger Room. Nightcrawler, the sound effect it makes when he teleports is BAMF, BAMF, which means something else on the internet now. But uh he always bumps everywhere when he teleports, and it leaves a big cloud
Is
of
it
smoke.
Banff or Banff?
Probably BAMF. I'm probably saying
Okay.
it wrong. It's probably BAMF.
Hmm.
Anyway, Kitty Pryde holds her nose like it stinks and goes yuck whenever he teleports. And that is something that I have never thought about. Does it smell horrible every time he teleports?
So I had to look this up to be exactly sure. So when he bamfs or bumps or however you actually say it, he travels through an alternate dimension known as the Brimstone dimension to move to place on Earth. So it's actually long been established that his teleportation therefore causes a slight smell of brimstone, the sulfuric smell of rotten eggs, to emerge from his teleportation. And it also causes a slight change in the atmosphere before he arrives, although only superhumans with heightened senses, such as Daredevil, can detect it. So I thought that was interesting, you know, kind of along with that too. So it's another moving through dimensions, you know, like we have Limbo and we have this Brimstone dimension and we have the Mirror dimension, and, you know, we have all these various different things that the characters use to do whatever. And I guess he brings back some Brimstone with him when he bamfs.
That's crazy. I got this mental image of him just like leaving fart clouds everywhere every time he teleports. And I'm like, this is horrible. Like all the other X-Men probably hate him, you know?
That's my secret. I eat beans and it allows me to teleport.
Yeah. So this story actually, I felt like did a pretty good job of taking it from an Avengers story and then moving it to the X-Men with Carol being knocked out, and now Spider-Woman has a reason to go to that group, you know, as opposed to going to the Avengers who don't have a telepath on the team. And that was one thing about this that I thought was really satisfying, is I did feel like the elements from different superhero books were woven together pretty organically, and I didn't feel like it felt like forced or like this was a crossover that was just being done as like a sales stunt or something like that. So
yeah, I don't know if this was something that was on purpose or if this was revealed somewhere, because I didn't find any info about it. But I kind of wondered if it was like, you know, Chris Claremont, he's writing Ms. Marvel, the title gets canceled, but he likes the character. So he's like, well, I'm writing this X-Men book. Why don't I find a way to bring her into the X-Men so that way I can still write using this character?
Right. That makes sense. Oh, so was Claremont writing Ms. Marvel at the time of its cancellation?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, so
he didn't start the it was like 76 to 79, I think, something like that. He didn't start with it, but he took over writing before it was over. Yeah, so he was involved with the original story that didn't get published, that we didn't see until 91.
Right.
That was his story. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that makes sense then, why she's included and why these characters crossed over. Anyway, I just thought it was really natural, and that's not always the case with, you know, crossing over different comic book titles. It doesn't always feel this organic. So
yeah,
that was good. One thing that did shock me, however, was that Mystique was leading the Brotherhood and not Magneto. So I don't know where Magneto is at this point in the X-Men's history, but I was really surprised to see Mystique be like the brains behind the whole thing, and she was kind of running the show, and they don't mention him at all.
Yeah, we don't hear about Magneto at all.
Anything about that, or
I don't, because it's on the X-Men, you know, history side of things. But it would be interesting to find out, because I know that Mystique used to be a major player, and you know that's why she was in charge of the Brotherhood. But I don't know at what point she kind of, because like in the X-Men movies, she's like subservient to Magneto.
Yeah,
or they're like friends, because he accepts her and says, oh, you know, you don't have to change into somebody else, just wear your blue face and I'll accept you. And that's kind of what Mystique does to Rogue, but well, not with the blue face thing, but you know, accepting them in and sort of manipulating them, you know, that way to serve them in whatever evil thing that they're doing. But yeah, we don't hear Magneto at all, so I don't know. I would assume he's a long-standing character, but maybe he didn't come till later. I don't know. They'll have to let us know on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm like 99% sure that Stan Lee introduced him, and he was the original leader. So there must be something going on continuity wise that removed him from the picture for this story. But it's kind of good because Mystique is more relevant to what's going on, because she's the one that, you know, not kidnapped Rogue, but sort of took her in and coerced her into joining the Brotherhood and all of that. So you don't really need him. It was just something that sort of stood out to me, because I'm used to seeing him running the show.
Yeah.
So I guess continuing talking about the X-Men related characters, which again we don't know as much about them, so I may be, just blowing smoke here, but I
Banff.
thought she was a little overpowered in this story. Like she takes out the Vision with one punch, she flattens Captain America, and she even takes down Thor without breaking a sweat, which actually Thor is probably the one that I can buy the most because she sort of comes at him from behind and he doesn't see her coming, and Rogue touches him and then absorbs all his strength.
Yeah.
But like Captain America, while I buy that if she could get to him, she could probably, trash him and steal his power. He is an amazing fighter, like amazing. And I don't know. I feel like the reason that we don't see the fight between them and we just see him like fly against a wall and then she's like, I stole his power now, is because it wouldn't have been believable because I don't see him losing in like hand to hand combat with her, even if she has super strength. I'm just
Yeah.
like, he's so amazing at what he does. Like, yeah, he's probably not as super powered as her after draining Ms. Marvel, sorry. But I just see him like flinging the shield at her head and knocking her out and being like, all right, we're good now.
Or knocking a statue down and smashing her.
Yeah.
Like Multiverse of Madness.
Yeah, something. I mean, oh my gosh. That was so terrible.
That was so bad.
Oh my gosh.
I guess the idea is that, she's got Miss Marvel's powers, and each power that she takes, not only does she have their powers, but she has their memories of like, well, now she knows Captain America's fighting style. She knows it's sort of like the Taskmaster, maybe not like,
Right.
eidetic copying or whatever, but she knows what to expect from him. So she's like, okay, I know that he's going to throw the shield. And when he does that, he's going to be vulnerable here. So that's where I'm going to go after him. So I think that's the idea, is she knows their weaknesses and has the super strength, but how much of that translates from, well, I absorbed your understanding and your fighting prowess, but I've never fought a day in my life. How good can I be at it? But it's just one of those weaknesses of storytelling where it's like, we need to get here in the story, and in order to do that, we have to take out the Avengers. So she's just going to go through and mow them down, and we give you an explanation, and let's move on with the story because of it. So, but it kind of leaves you a little bit like, again, like, so if the Avengers are so powerful, and all of these groups, like we talked, I think in the last episode, it's like, if they're not that powerful because one person can take them down, then what's the point of the group? Like, oh, the Avengers, I heard they got, whooped by a Southern belle named Rogue, when she was like, darling, and then they were done. So don't call the Avengers.
That is exactly how she talks too. I think the other one that bothered me a little bit was Simon, or Wonder Man, just because he's made of living energy, which they did bring up.
Yeah.
That she can't absorb his power because it's not actually skin that she's touching. But then she like throws him into a building and it knocks him out. And that didn't make sense to me that would.
Well, I think it's a
knock him
building like
unconscious.
20 miles away or something like that.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of like in, I don't remember if it was Endgame or Infinity War, but like when Carol comes to confront Thanos and then he like absorbs the like power stone and then punches her into orbit.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's one of those things where it was just so much of a force that it like stunned him temporarily and he went flying, or like a Dragon Ball Z thing where you see Goku for like, 20 minutes, like flying through the air and,
So what you're
eventually
saying
landing.
is that Wonder Man has to travel 20 episodes on Snake Way to get back to the battle.
That's why he's out for so long. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. So I think it's at this point in the story that they give us a little bit of a flashback after Rogue has trashed the Avengers. And you get the Avengers side of Carol's history at this point. We don't get Carol's side of it until the end of the story, but here is where the Avengers sort of describe that they're like, yeah, we didn't really know her that well. She was on the team, but there was this guy named Immortus, and he came from another dimension and, basically conceived a child with her, seemingly against her will. But the strange thing is the Avengers all celebrated that this baby was born named Marcus, and they were all happy about that, and they didn't really ask her how she was doing. And so the reason this is important is because this story was written by a previous writer in Avengers, and it was almost immediately received poorly for that reason, because all of the like male heroes come in and basically focus on the birth of the baby, and they don't really pay any attention to the fact that like Carol has been through a really traumatic experience. And then to make matters worse, what happens is that baby ages rapidly, and apparently it's also some incarnation of Immortus. And so that this now adult child that she had named Marcus is like, oh, I'm in love with you, and then coerces her to go back to like limbo with him. And I guess that's what happens.
Yeah.
So my I was cringing pretty hard when like Hawkeye was relaying these events, because I was like, I knew that this happened. I knew it was part of her history, but I didn't know we were going to visit it. And I didn't realize like how bad that it was. So,
Yeah. So in the Avengers number 200 in October of 1980, this story came out, and there's several, there's criticisms, backlash. She was suddenly 9 months pregnant overnight. And so Immortus is, from what I understand, Immortus is from Limbo, but he's also a time traveler. And so in order to escape Limbo, he used some like machinery or equipment that Hawkeye ends up destroying that allows him to materialize in our world through Carol's body. But it's weird because it's like the adult him is like wooing her to get the child him born, who will eventually grow up and become him again. And again, this is that like weird, this wasn't Chris Claremont,
also
but
woo her.
Yeah. So and so the reason that we have Avengers Annual number 10 is because Chris Claremont was one of the many people who this did not sit well with them.
Right.
And so what he did was he wrote Carol coming back to Earth using Immortus' technology. So he continues to age, he dies of old age, she's like, I'm out of here. She finds a way to use that technology to get back to Earth. And she doesn't want to go see the Avengers because they didn't ask the right questions. They're just like, well, Carol, good for you. We're happy for you. Go be happy. And they did not know that something was seriously wrong. So she didn't want to go back to them. So she's kind of hiding out. And that's where Rogue finds her and absorbs her powers, throws her off the bridge, and she's rescued by Spider-Woman. So Carol feels betrayed by the Avengers because they didn't, show concern for this strange pregnancy or do any investigation in Marcus' claims. But, she had to rely on her own strength to get through those trying times. And I think that's Claremont trying to take this terrible criticism and backlash and all the stuff with this character and to fix it into something that we can move on from it. Like we're putting an end to this story. We're moving on from it. Now, where is the character? She doesn't want to be with the Avengers. She's kind of, by herself. She's not in limbo anymore, even though she's kind of in like her own mental limbo. Right. So what do we do with her? So now she gets attacked by Rogue. She has this traumatic event, which she has many of. But then eventually she moves to the X-Men, and now she's one of the X-Men for a while until eventually she goes back to the Avengers. So so the reason that we have this is we have a recap to, tell you what happened, but also to show that we're moving her in a different direction. And that's kind of why we have this in here.
Yeah. So initially I was like, I don't want them to ever reference that story again at all. Like, I'm not even happy that they're bringing it up here. But I realized as we got further down the line, and especially when we got to the end, that like, oh, Claremont is really trying to fix something that was done by another writer. And unfortunately, the writer and penciler are big name people that were behind that story, that would go on to massive success at DC.
Some that we've reviewed in our episodes too.
Yeah, I mean, so they're a big deal, and you can look up who that is online. I mean, it's pretty well documented. But I think Claremont, rightfully so, was like, this is a problem. We've got to fix this. So
and he tackled it head on rather than just wiping it away and being like, we're over here now. He directly confronted it and said, this is what happened, and now we're cleaning it up and moving on.
Yeah, I think it was interesting too that they show both sides of the discussion, because the end of the story, which we will get to, has Carol telling her side. But first we get just Hawkeye's side of the story, and they're just kind of like, well, she's in love with that guy, so we let her go to another dimension. We didn't really know her, so no big deal. And later you find out like it was kind of a big deal though. So,
Yeah, it was very big deal.
I really felt when we got to the big knockdown drag out fight at the end where we've got Spider-Woman, we've got the Avengers that are still standing trying to fight the Brotherhood of Mutants at where they were incarcerated. I really started to feel at this point that Claremont's writing is biased towards the mutant characters because there were a lot of things that required suspension of disbelief for me throughout the story. That you did talk about Iron Man earlier.
Yeah.
That was the first one where I was kind of like, oh, okay, it's kind of weird that she just has the device that can immobilize him, but whatever. Captain America was another one where I was like, all right, I guess she beat Captain America. But then we even get to Wonder Man fighting Pyro, and Pyro makes a giant phoenix out of flame and is like buffeting Wonder Man with it. And my question is, why does he care? Because he's made of energy. So does that even hurt him?
Like, oh no, my secret weakness, fire. I don't know.
Like I don't think that does anything to him, but it seems to, at least again, it's another like we throw him like halfway across the city and then he has to like come back with a water tower in his hand. And I don't know. I was just getting this sense during the story that he really was like, I'm writing an Avengers story, but I want to be writing an X-Men story. And I don't know if that came through to you or not at all, but I was kind of getting that vibe.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the Avengers were dispatched pretty quickly to get to the X-Men story, so it was definitely like we want to focus on them more, and the drive was to get Carol and Rogue into the X-Men world. But yeah, the Avengers, it really didn't seem like they had a whole lot that they were able to do, and I really don't know much about Wonder Man, so I can't say if that's with his powers or not.
Yeah,
but yeah, it was interesting too because we have Pyro and we have Avalanche, right? And I'm just like, so these are the two big bad guys that we're going to have square off against the Avengers and be leading the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants with Mystique and Destiny and that sort of thing. I'm like, couldn't you have found some like more? Maybe they were A-list villains at the time. I don't know, but
yeah, I don't know.
It just didn't seem very threatening.
Both of those guys seem like kind of B or C list at best.
Yeah, they're like henchmen.
Like I've never taken Pyro very seriously. He's always he's the guy that tags along and causes some problems, but he's not like the main threat.
Squaring off against Wonder Man.
Yeah, but they fought him for like a long time, and who was it? Beast like jumped off the blob, and then somebody else grabbed him like out of his throw, and they were he jumped on Pyro, I think it was. And then Mystique was like, well, he's kind of a loser, so I was willing to sacrifice him in order to get this hit in on you or something like that.
No,
and so at that point,
it was the other way around. So Beast. So the problem was Destiny was calling out the shots.
Oh, that's right. Destiny.
Because she knew what they were going to do, and so she's like, "Oh, Beast is going to go after like Pyro or something," and so she skips over him and goes for somebody else. And Beast is like, "Yeah, well, I tricked you out because you thought I was going for him, but I went for him." And Destiny's like, well, I was willing to sacrifice a pawn to take you out, and then like the building falls on him or whatever. So that was part of it. Destiny was giving them the inside scoop of what they were going to do, so that's partly why they were vanquished so easily. But again,
I don't know. I would have rather they used somebody that was in a different weight class to fight so many Avengers towards the end. Although like once Spider-Woman rescued Iron Man and Scarlet Witch kind of like got her second wind and she got back up, like they just started trashing the Brotherhood. I mean, it was over really quick once Iron Man rejoined the fight. And I mean, I guess it's that thing of like Rogue can't touch her, so like what's she gonna do? Or can't touch him. I mean, she also can't touch Spider-Woman. Yeah. So like what's she gonna do to them? Although Spider-Woman did give her like a full-on venom blast at one point, and I know Rogue just kind of stood there like, okay, I don't care.
Yeah.
Like I've absorbed Thor and Captain America, but I did like that it was explained within the final battle that her taking of Cap and Thor's powers was like starting to wear off. So she was at a weaker point now. So that that made it a little bit easier to swallow, where I was like, okay, so she can power up like this, but it doesn't last forever. It made me think of like Parasite from like Superman, how he
Yeah.
like absorbs powers and memories from people, but then like he has to keep doing it.
Hmm.
Whereas him, I think he has to do it to like, because he has just like this hunger he has to feed, you know.
Yeah.
With Rogue, it's more just like, well, I need more power, so I'm going to use you to juice up and, you know, whatever. But
Yeah.
Scarlet Witch was like awesome. I really liked her at the end of this story. And I don't think I've ever seen an explanation of her powers, but Claremont gives us one here, which I thought was really cool. So I didn't know
Hmm.
what you thought about that, but
Yeah, I liked, because the Scarlet Witch that I'm most familiar with is either like kind of like we got in the movies, where she
mhm,
has this energy that she's able to like do physical things with it, kind of
mhm.
like telekinesis, or just the full on like, hey, I had some kind of psychotic episode and now I've altered reality for, everybody in like the House of M storyline. So
Right.
she's either got, some kind of like sort of telekinetic power, or she's got, mind altering, reality changing,
Right.
you know, epic level abilities. But it was cool here because it was like, it was something that is very, I don't want to say definable, but is definitely not on the like world ending epic level, where she's able to just kind of like change things. And I'm going to steal from your notes here that you put like domino. So
Yeah. Yeah.
like her, where in the Deadpool movie especially, we just see things just work out for Domino. Like something's coming
Right.
at her and she just happens to move out of the way because there was something else that was
Mhm.
blocked it from her, and it just, everything just works out in her favor no matter what she does. And because of her like probability powers. And so it was cool to see Scarlet Witch of like, she's able to manipulate those things, and so she's able
Mhm.
to sort of influence, but she doesn't have the ability to directly like either again alter reality, or something just as
Yeah.
lame as like, I can whisper in your ear with some red energy and make you hallucinate. Woo. But she can actually like change things kind of like on a larger scale,
Right.
but not like off the deep end. So I
Yeah,
thought
yeah,
that
it
was
was
cool too.
cool. He's what did he say? It's like her hex spheres expend energy and cause random effects,
Mm,
but they're always like to her benefit. So like there was a part where they were like throwing something over the blob's head, and or maybe he was throwing something over their head, and Vision was like, "My love, use your powers," and she did her hex sphere on it and like turned it into harmless dust or something,
yeah.
and there was I think Pyro made like a giant fire monster and she changed it into stone, and then it just like crumbled and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, I actually really like this character. Like her
Hmm.
power set is cool and I'd like to see more of this. So yeah, I
It
haven't read
was,
much about her, but it was nice that it seemed like it was defined and it also had limitations where it wasn't just like
yeah.
this crazy world ending thing.
It was
So
kind of like the in the Harry Potter movies, where Dumbledore actually, like confronts Voldemort in that like short little battle that we get. And so Voldemort like breaks glass and he's like hurling all these shards, and then, Dumbledore's protecting Harry, so he like turns it into snow. It
right.
was that kind of thing where it's like, it's like a fight of like transmutation almost, more
Hmm.
so than, direct confrontation. And that's a cool power that I don't think that we see a whole lot.
No, we really don't. The only person at DC that really does like transmuting of elements, and he's more science based, is Firestorm. I mean,
Mm,
he's the
yeah.
guy at DC that would kind of be known for doing that, but he's always got this kind of like nuclear radiation angle, and it's just different. So yeah.
Well,
Anyway,
and
I just
it's a cool gameplay element too, although they seem to give that more to now I'm drawing a blank, in Midnight Suns,
oh yeah.
the like where you use a card and there's like some kind of random effect that could happen to the enemies, or something
Hmm.
like that. Like that's from a gameplay standpoint, because you use an ability from a character and you're like, let's see what happens. Who knows? It'll either do a ton of damage to one enemy or a little bit to multiple, or it'll
Right.
buff me instead. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. I think you were gonna say they gave it to Nico
Yeah.
Minoru from the
Yeah.
Runaways. Yeah. So overall, this was a lot of narrative packed into one issue. It is an annual, so it's like a double-sized issue. So I think it was
Hmm.
48 pages or something like that. So but it is a lot happens in this story, and I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, but it ends with Carol is eventually revived once the Avengers, are able to scare off the Brotherhood. Rogue leaves, kind of licking her wounds to go back to Mystique, presumably. And Carol is at the X Mansion, Westchester, whatever that's called. The X Mansion is probably not what it's called, but she's with Charles Xavier, and he's kind of like restored her mind, because there was an aspect of this where her entire personality had been wiped too.
Yeah.
I think so.
Rather than just stealing her memories, she like stole her psyche and that kind of thing, which Rogue will have to fight later.
Right. So it was kind of neat that we ended it. It turned into this big action spectacle, but it does end on a character moment with Carol.
Mhm.
And this really saved the story for me, because up until this point, Carol had not had anything active to do in the story. And I really felt like that was a big problem. I wanted to see her actually have some agency as a character, but it's kind of like on Star Trek, whenever they would have a Deanna Troi episode in TNG, usually it's not really about her as a person. It's about something that's happening to her. Like, oh, in this one, her empathic powers get taken away. Play that. Or in this one, an alien intelligence is reaching out to her because of her empathic abilities. Play that. But it's not like, who is she as a person? Like, they don't really
Right.
talk about that. So I kind of felt that way about this story until we got to the end, and Carol gets to confront the Avengers and be like, you guys just kind of like left me out to dry. Like, I was being coerced by this guy. I didn't want to go to limbo, but he was suppressing my will basically with his abilities, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. And so I've been through all this horrible trauma, and you guys were just like smiling because I had a child. So,
Overnight.
yeah, overnight, which again, so I think rightfully so, she was like angry, and they're just kind of shocked, like, oh, we thought you were fine. We didn't know anything was wrong. And, they kind of leave and have to just let go of it. But I would definitely be interested to read more after this to see how she sort of reconciles with that group and how they come back together, because she's very much associated with the Avengers now, not the X-Men. So, yeah, I don't know. Did you feel like that was a good way for Claremont to sort of not retcon, but address the bad story in the past and kind of wipe it away?
Yeah, so we'll get into this more in the after show as far as what happens later. But this was a way to sort of cut ties with the Avengers officially and, give her a reason to stay with the X-Men, because, Charles Xavier is helping her sort of reclaim her life. And then she has to figure out who she is now that she doesn't have any of these powers or anything. Because it's not like she could rejoin the Avengers if she wanted to, because she's powerless essentially. So.
Right.
So it was really, I think, a good like character moment as far as, giving her a way to, like you were saying, ask, well, who am I, apart from the powers, and how do I, reclaim what I've lost? But also at the same time, turning a really heavily criticized and controversial story into something that's actually usable. And so we can still have this character, because if that was the kind of story, that just that could have ruined the character, and then we never would have seen Carol Danvers ever again. Like, somebody wrote the story in 79, and it just people had a bad taste after that and didn't want to hear about this character anymore, and we just stopped like writing stories. And because there are heroes out there that they had books for a while, and then they didn't have books for like 10 years or more. And then maybe they make cameos and that's it. And they weren't popular. So this could have been, a career ending, I guess, for Ms. Marvel, but, it makes up for that and then gives her something new to do in the future. So that way she's not just, well, all is forgiven. We just join the Avengers back and move on as if nothing happened. Like, this is a big deal, and it changes her for years to come.
Yeah. So I think that's going to wrap up our discussion of the Avengers Annual. We did also look at Marvel Superheroes number 11, which a question that I had that you've actually already answered now was, why was this published a decade after the story that we just read? Because it's basically a prequel to it,
Yeah.
where Carol is investigating the murder of her psychiatrist by the evil Brotherhood mutant Mystique. While doing so, she stumbles upon an arms deal involving the Hellfire Club, which eventually leads her to Hong Kong in search of Mystique, who Carol believes will cause the death of Rogue, her adopted daughter. So this now explains why, in the story we just read, why Mystique is after Carol in the first place. Because in the Avengers Annual, it did seem to kind of come out of nowhere. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to know that Claremont had already planned this story, already written it, but he didn't get to publish it because that title was canceled. So it's kind of nice that in 92, like Marvel gave him the opportunity to like, hey, go ahead and put that out there so that people know kind of the backstory. But
Yeah.
The fight between Rogue and Ms. Marvel was actually never supposed to happen because Rogue like kind of overhears Mystique or something talking about like, oh, this person might get you or whatever. And so she goes off,
She
she goes
forces the issue.
rogue and goes and fights Carol by herself. And that's when she gets like overloaded by the feedback from the power. And actually Carol was like beating the crap out of her before Rogue like
Well,
actually
yeah.
touched her and started draining her, which I was so happy to see because the like my really biggest criticism of the Avengers issue was I wanted to see Miss Marvel be more active than she was. And
Mhm.
the fact that she was in a coma meant we had people commenting on her, but we didn't get her opinion on stuff
Yeah.
until the very end. I really the only thing I would have changed having finished it now and pairing it up with this issue is that I maybe would have liked her to have defeated Marcus or Immortus herself and not had him just die and then she's able to escape. It
Yeah.
would have been nice to have her have some kind of like superhero moment in there, but the backstory in Marvel Superheroes 11 was definitely good, and I think if you're going to read this story, it would enhance it for you to go read that as sort of a companion piece. So,
Mhm. Yeah, it kind of sets up what happens because otherwise it's just
mhm.
like, hey, look, Ms. Marvel's falling off a bridge. Why is
Right.
this happening? Why is she in a coma? What's going on? And that was part of it because like even at first they didn't even know that it was Carol. They're just like
Mhm.
Jane Doe is in a hospital bed and they're like, that's Carol Danvers. What happened? And it's like it was probably a surprise to the readers as well when it came out. And then, it isn't 10 years later until you get like
Mhm.
the sort of preamble to that, but
Right.
we get it both at once because we are very far removed from the 1980s and 90s.
Yeah, that's very true. The 90s feel like they weren't that long ago, but they really, really were.
Yeah.
One thing, so they keep referencing a seventh sense that she has in this story,
Yeah.
and it seems like she gets like visions of the future, and then they like knock her out, and it's like debilitating. And yeah,
Mhm.
what is that? Because I
So
had
this
no
is
idea.
this is one of those like products of the 60s or 70s where it's like,
Okay,
and the character has this mysterious seventh sense which alerts her
yeah,
to danger. And so originally, the original iteration of Ms. Marvel, she was one of those characters that, like I mentioned before, so she like the psyche magnetron exploded, she got this power, she got superhuman strength, speed, resistance
hmm
to injury, power of flight, a minor degree of energy manipulation, but she basically got this like danger sense that when she would go to sleep, it would wake her up and transform her into Ms. Marvel, and she would go out and fight crime. And then when she was done with that, she'd have no actual knowledge of what she'd done when she was asleep. So
Oh,
that
that
was
is
the original.
weird.
Yeah. So that's been something that's been used, many times for other characters. So then Chris Claremont takes over, and of course, being the clairvoyant Claremont that he is, turns it into like a precognitive sense, kind of like, mimicking a spider sense, but she gets
Mhm.
specific information. So there's comics where she knows exactly where a missile is targeting, or she knows that
Mm.
somebody like an AIM agent is pointing a gun at her back and she knows exactly where they are, not just because of like, an awareness sense, but she knows that somebody's going to be behind her in sort of like a precognition, very specific, as
Right.
for what's going on. So then Claremont starts to change it a little bit where she starts getting these flashes or visions. And, again, that being a lot of his writing where characters are getting visions of impending doom that guide their
Mhm.
actions. So the interesting thing about this seventh sense is that Rogue would have absorbed this, but we don't really see her use it. And
No.
then Carol actually does regain her powers later, but she really doesn't come back with it. Although there's things that happen that make you wonder, like, well, was that it? But none of the writers pick it back up, and they're like,
Oh,
hey, so the
interesting.
seventh sense, it just kind of like disappears into the ether. And sometimes she can sense things, or she can, change her clothes without actually stopping to change, but transform her clothes.
Right.
And there's not really an explanation. So maybe that's the seventh sense, but I don't think there's anything like official, or nobody really knows if that actually like still exists as one of her powers.
Yeah, that's interesting. While you were talking, the wheels were kind of spinning in my head, and I was thinking about the movie, and it was it not some sort of like quantum propulsion drive or something that explodes in the movie, or was it okay? So that to me would almost justify it in some sense, because if it's some sort of quantum drive, maybe we know from like Romulans in Star Trek that can cause all kinds of temporal anomalies and chronotons and all those particles and things of that nature. So if they were to link it to maybe there was some sort of quantum singularity in the psyche magnetron that exploded, then I could see there being justification for this ability. So I think that's maybe a way that you could bring it back or justify it if you were really trying to do it.
Actually use it. But it was more just like, this is her infamous seventh sense. It's just like this mystical thing. And then it just sort of gets dropped. Because I don't think it's something that's really integral to her character, or really, and plus it might make her a little too powerful, because it's like, okay, I have a spider sense and I can fly, and I have like, Thor, Hulk level strength, and I can do all, like, okay, well, what can't you do? There's got to be
fire
some
like energy blasts from her hands,
and I can I can redirect energy, or I can absorb it, when it's fired at me. So that way, if like Superman gets hit by a laser, he might go oof, but Carol's just like, oh, I absorbed that energy.
Right.
And kryptonite doesn't hurt her. So it's like, what weakness does she have? So I think that was like kind of a natural, like, we don't really need this thing. Let's forget about it.
Oh, that makes sense. I did stop the ums. I did think that at this point, once I got to the superhero issue, I really started to feel fatigue on the sort of alternate possible future thing, just because I've read, I've read Claremont's run on Fantastic Four. We do it there. He was doing it in the previous story, and now we reveal that Destiny was the one giving Mystique information about the future and said, well, Carol Danvers is going to cause the downfall of your adopted daughter, Rogue. So you've got to take her out of the picture. And while I appreciate that it gave extra context to the story from the 80s, I think I would have liked something a little more tangible there. I don't know. How did you feel about that?
Well, it's like one of those like irony things where, you're playing with the future of some vision that, somebody has, and through action or inaction, will you cause it to come to pass? And so Mystique's like, hey, let's do the inaction route, but I'm going to, find a way to kill her, indirectly. Right. And then Rogue is just like, oh, well, if she's such a big threat, why don't I just take her head on, and just like jumps in there. And so it's like, so through Mystique's inaction, Rogue was able to overhear and take action. And now, this came to pass anyway. And it's like, so much speculation, but really the whole point of it is we're trying to get Rogue and Carol together, so that way she can steal her powers. And so it's very convoluted, and probably could have been maybe a little more grounded. But again, just being a storytelling trope of Chris Claremont, it's like he's going to use that excuse for everything that he can possibly write.
It does seem like
visions
that.
of the future.
So it made me smile a little bit, but I also at this point was like, all right, so more future future stuff. Okay,
we have a whole character that can do this, and we have a character with a seventh sense that can do this, and we've got like everybody and their brother can see visions of the future. So I
was glad that they removed that from Carol later, because I definitely felt like having her and Destiny both in the same story was too much of that, like too many people telling the future. So,
well, anything before we move to final thoughts?
No, I don't think so.
All right, let's do it.
We like
Comics.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
because they have a home.
Welcome back, everybody. I think I'm ready to go first on final thoughts. So
Go for it.
when I first read this, especially before I got to Marvel Superheroes number 11, I was going to land on like a 3. I was like, this is definitely a 3. It's perfectly competent, feels like it's tied into the larger universe. But really, the big problem I had with it was I wanted to see Carol be more involved in the story, and she was unconscious for like the entire thing. And that really kind of stuck in my craw because I was just like, I wanted to see her stand on her own as a character. I wanted to, really see more conflict between her and Rogue, but it seemed to be more the things happening to her as opposed to what she was doing actively in the story. So while I acknowledge that all those things are legitimate, the end scene where she confronts the Avengers does really help it for me.
Yeah.
That does salvage it and make it feel like finally, okay, now her character has a voice. Now she has something to say about the events that have been happening to her, and it's not just everybody else's impressions of her. So that was good. And knowing that it kind of moves her into a better period of her comic history also kind of bumps it up a little bit for me. And then honestly, one of the things that hugely made this more enjoyable was just the few panels that we see her absolutely trashing Rogue in Marvel Superheroes really helped me to appreciate this more because I was like, yes, she is a good fighter. She is powerful. She can, take on this X-Man that she's never seen before. So I think that's going to bring it up to a 3.5 for me. And I don't know what it would take to push it to a 4. I just think maybe if we could have a little more time spent with Carol where she is an active participant as opposed to being just kind of a non-combatant for the whole story. I think that would definitely increase my enjoyment of it. But yeah, 3.5 I think is fair. I think it's a good story. I'm definitely glad that I read it. There were just a few things like that, especially being more an Avengers fan, I was really wanting to see more focus on her. So yeah, 3.5 for me.
So this is one of those hard to rate things where, for me, it's hard to look at just this, one story arc and rate just that one thing, because there are so many things that happen after this that, shape the future of really both characters. And, so to say that it's, good or bad is kind of difficult because, you're picking out just this one little spot in time, regardless, of how it affected the future or not, because, this to me really saved the Ms. Marvel Carol Danvers character. Like, she could have been just out of commission, and Chris Claremont brought her back and was able to salvage, what had been done in the past, and then, take her even further into the future with her time with the X-Men. So, it's hard to not give it a really high score because of that. But to judge it just on how it is as a comic, like for me, going back to reading comics in the 70s and 80s can be challenging because it was just a different time. Things were written differently. There's even different terminology, like, a helicopter is a whirlybird, and, the way that people talk to each other, and, how women are treated and things like that are very different. And like Iron Man, I mean, he's more like a man who wears a suit of iron than a guy who has this like supercomputer with an AI and, all the stuff that we see in like modern iterations. So
yeah,
it's very different. But the thing that's worked really well for me is going back and reading the Ms. Marvel comics from this era. Like, whatever it is, I've really been able to get into those, to read them, to enjoy them. And even with this story that we've read, even though like part of it's from like 91 or 92, I found it very easy to read, and it flowed very naturally, and it was written very well. And I don't feel like it's aged a huge amount, where some of the stuff from the 70s, it's just like, well, this was, an entirely different like era of human history or whatever. Like, some of the stuff's way out there. So I give it bonus points for, what it brought to comics history and the ease of reading and the just overall enjoyment. So I'm actually going to give this one a 4.25 just to give, a little edge on the math for Mike. But I feel like this one, like, like I would give this probably a 4 out of 5, but I'm giving it those like 0.25 bonus points for the things that I mentioned. Like I just, thought this was an exciting time in Marvel history, and especially with Ms. Marvel. And I really like I was introduced to more Captain Marvel and sort of the modern iterations, and then actually went back to the beginning and read, all the way through her comic history on the Marvel Unlimited app. And I've just really enjoyed it. It's been easy to read and fun, and I liked it.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, we talk so much about how context changes the way you receive stories, and that's something that is constantly being brought up here. So I think that's one reason why it's good to pick stuff like this where you've got a lot of background and I don't, or vice versa, because we are going to look at it a little bit differently. So I mean, I think that totally makes sense. And I totally respect the legacy of this character and know that, it's going to go more positive directions from here. I just unfortunately am not aware of what those are because I haven't read as much as you. So
sure. Well, we'll get into some of it in the after show, so stick around. Go to YouTube.
All right. Well, that'll be good. So everybody out there, tell us what you think of this comic by posting on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else. And be sure to use the hashtag Boneless Comics Podcast.
That's right. And you can read these issues on, like an app, or you can pick them up individually, but you can also get this really nice collection. You can find it on our Amazon store at bonelesscomicspodcast.com, but it includes the issues that we discussed today, and it goes into the future to talk about the Uncanny X-Men and X-Men Legacy and Captain Marvel all the way up to 2019. So some pretty recent stuff in here that you can sort of, what is the aftermath? What happens after this battle? And you can find out more in this trade that they put together. So check out our Amazon store.
I actually am very interested in borrowing that because
the
most interesting part of this story to me is where does it go from here? So and again, we keep bringing up Star Trek, but I like character studies. I like stuff that focuses on specific characters and really picks out elements, and we get to learn more about them. So that I think that would be really an enjoyable read. So everybody also don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for the after show, where we're going to discuss all things Captain Marvel, and tune in next time for the Addams Family from 1974 by Gold Key Comics. And thanks everybody for listening.
Get you later.